Hey everyone, I hope everyone's doing well and having fun at med school. So today I'm going to talk about and explain the neuroanatomy and working of one of my favorite part of neuroanatomy, the basal ganglia. So let's get right into it, shall we? Before I begin, I would just like to provide an overview of everything that is going to be covered in this lecture. We are going to start by introducing the basal ganglia, followed by some basic neuroanatomy, followed by an explanation of the functions of the basal ganglia. Then we're going to move on to the working of the basal ganglia, where we're going to look at the direct pathway, the indirect pathway, and also the contribution of substantia nigra. And I would conclude this lecture by stating some clinical significance of the basal ganglia, where we are going to study some associated conditions in which the basal ganglia is damaged. Basal, gang- basal ganglia are a group of subcortical nuclei located within the brain. Their function is regulation of voluntary movements as well as a learning and memory function involving motor movements. Talking about the neuroanatomy of basal ganglia, as I mentioned in the previous slide, these are just a group of subcortical nuclei located within the brain. The largest part of the basal ganglia is known as the striatum, which consists of the caudate nucleus and the putamen. Followed by the putamen, we have the globus pallidus, which is divided into an external and an internal part. The globus pallidus and the putamen together form what is known as the lentiform nucleus. The other components of the basal ganglia include the subthalamic nucleus, the thalamus itself, and finally the substantia nigra. To be precise, the compact part or pars compacta of the substantia nigra. The functions of the basal ganglia include regulation of voluntary movement, which is its most important function, and I'll be explaining that shortly with an example. And it also helps in learning of skillful movements such as playing the piano. Not just that, it also carries a memory function to help perform these movements later on. Research has also shown that the basal ganglia is involved in emotions, habit formation, as well as in the reward and reinforcement pathways. Here, I will be explaining how does the basal ganglia help in bringing out well-regulated, precise, fine-tuned voluntary movement with the help of a very simple scheme. Let's take an example of swinging a golf club, which requires a certain amount of power and precision for every shot. First up, the thought of swinging the golf club itself arises in the motor cortex, which includes our primary, supplementary, and premotor areas. This thought is then conveyed to the basal ganglia structures, which process the info and also receives input from the substantia nigra, facilitating in the overall process. This processed info is then conveyed to the thalamus, specifically the ventro-anterior and the ventrolateral nuclei, and from there back to the motor cortex. Then, through the infamous corticospinal tract and the lower motor neurons going to the skeletal muscle, this fine-tuned, well-processed, precise movement is then brought into action. And all of this actually happens at a mighty fast speed in split seconds. It's so instantaneous, which is why this is just so beautiful, and also the reason why I just love the basal ganglia. So the last slide was just a very simple explanation of how the basal ganglia brings about its function. Within the basal ganglia, we actually have two pathways, the direct pathway and the indirect pathway, which work simultaneously to bring about the fine, precise movements which I just mentioned. The direct pathway is involved with stimulation of motor activity, so it helps us in initiating and maintaining motor activity. And the indirect pathway is involved in inhibition of motor activity, to be specific, inhibiting the unwanted movements. So first, let's start with explanation of the direct pathway, which is involved in initiation and maintenance of voluntary motor movements. So the circuit begins at the motor cortex, which then sends its glutaminergic fibers to the striatum. Now we know that the glutaminergic fibers release glutamate, which is a stimulatory neurotransmitter, which will stimulate the GABAergic neurons located within the striatum. Now, when the GABAergic neurons are stimulated, these are then going to release GABA, an inhibitory neurotransmitter, into the globus pallidus internus and the substantia nigra reticular part. Now, since GABA is released here, which is an inhibitory neurotransmitter, what is that going to do is that it's going to inhibit the, the GABAergic neurons, which travel from the globus pallidus to the thalamus, also known as the pallidothalamic pathway. Now, since less GABA is going to be released into the thalamus, this is going to result in what is known as disinhibition, which will ultimately result in the stimulation of the glutaminergic fibers of the thalamus, which will go to the motor cortex, release glutamate, stimulate the motor cortex, and then finally activate the corticospinal system, which will result in bringing about the required movement. So talking about the indirect pathway of the basal ganglia, this is involved in preventing any unwanted motor movements. So once again, we start at the motor cortex, which releases glutamate at the striatum. Now we know that glutamate is a stimulatory neurotransmitter, which will activate the GABAergic neurons of the striatum. The striatum is then going to release GABA at the globus pallidum externus through its GABAergic fibers. The release of GABA is actually going to result in the inhibition of the GABAergic neurons traveling from the external globus pallidus to the subthalamic nucleus. This is known as disinhibition, as I mentioned previously, and is actually going to result in stimulation of the glutaminergic fibers within the subthalamic nucleus, which are going to travel to the globus pallidum internus and is actually going to result in the activation of the pallidothalamic tract, which, as you guys recall, release GABA at the thalamus. Now, since this tract is activated, a lot of GABA is actually going to be released within the thalamus. And we know that GABA is inhibitory, right? Which is going to result in inhibition of the glutaminergic fibers traveling from the thalamus to the motor cortex, resulting in an overall less excitatory signal traveling to the motor cortex and hence less activation of the corticospinal system, overall a reduced amount of movement. Coming now to the substantia nigra. The substantia nigra, which means black substance in Latin, is located within the midbrain. This part appears relatively darker than the rest of the brain due to high levels of the pigment melanin within the dopaminergic neurons located. The function of the substantia nigra is that it greatly influences movement by acting on the direct and indirect pathway and resulting in an overall increased movement. So it really helps amp up your movement. These dopaminergic fibers actually travel to the striatum via the nigrostriatal pathway where they release dopamine and through different mechanisms influence the direct and indirect pathway, which I'll be explaining shortly, resulting in an overall increased movement. Substantia nigra actually influences the direct pathway is that it releases dopamine within the striatum, which acts via the D1 receptors to stimulate GABAergic neurons traveling from striatum to the globus pallidus internal. So if you think about it, the striatum is actually receiving double stimulation signals. One is glutamate from the cortex and the other is dopamine from the substantia nigra. This will really fire up the GABAergic neurons traveling from the striatum to the globus pallidum, causing insane inhibition of the pallidothalamic tract, which will ultimately result in intense stimulation of the glutamatergic neurons traveling to the motor cortex and hence causing increased movement. Talking about the influence of substantia nigra on the indirect pathway, the release of dopamine through the nigrostriatal pathway acts on the D2 receptors within the striatum, which is an inhibitory receptor, inhibiting the GABAergic neurons within. If these neurons are inhibited, less GABA is going to be released at the globus pallidus external, resulting in stimulation of the GABAergic neurons coursing from the globus pallidus external to the subthalamic nucleus. This will result in an inhibition of the glutaminergic neurons coursing from the subthalamic nucleus to the globus pallidus internal, resulting in a less glutamate release and hence inhibition of the pallidothalamic tract, which will ultimately result in the stimulation of the glutaminergic neurons traveling from the thalamus to the motor cortex, resulting in an overall increased movement. Basal ganglia is of great clinical significance, and any kind of damage involving the basal ganglia can result in severe movement disorders. These disorders are classified into hypo and hypokinetic disorders. An example for a hypokinetic disorder is none other than Parkinson's disease, which is described as degeneration of the dopaminergic neurons within the substantia nigra, resulting in a difficulty to initiate and maintain movements. The clinical syndrome of Parkinson's disease shows symptoms like tremor, rigidity, characteristic shuffling gait, and mask-like or poker face. Talking about hyperkinetic disorders, a well-known example is Huntington's disease, which is defined as the degeneration of GABAergic neurons in globus pallidus external, resulting in an overall increased movement due to reduced inhibition. It is characterized by chorea, which is rapid involuntary muscle contractions, and athetosis, which is snake-like movement of the hands. Dementia and depression is also seen in Huntington's disease, and suicide is the most common cause of death. That's the end of my lecture. I really hope it all made sense and came together. Feel free to hit me up on Instagram, Facebook, send me an email if anything. Alright, everyone, see you on the flippity flip.